The day began quietly, the kind of quiet that makes you notice what's missing before you notice what's there. I watched my daughter, 5 years old, unwrap the gifts I had placed carefully on the living room floor. Her small hands lingered on each one, excitement in her eyes. But then she looked at the empty space near the sofa where her grandparents should have left something. I didn't speak. I waited. My parents stood across the room, their smiles stiff, eyes flicking away when she glanced at them. "We forgot," my mother said, a line so light it almost seemed accidental. But I heard the weight behind it. Something was being hidden, something I was only beginning to see. I remember the morning like it was a photograph, still, ordered, almost painfully ordinary. The sunlight filtered through the living room blinds in thin lines, falling across the carpet in a pattern I could trace with my eyes. My daughter sat cross-legged, humming softly as she arranged her small toys in a circle, each one exactly where it belonged. I stayed by the kitchen counter, watching her. There was a rhythm to these mornings, quiet but precise. She believed in the world as I had built it for her, one of small certainties where routines were sacred and people kept their promises. Breakfast was simple, eggs and toast, nothing fancy, but enough. My parents arrived later, punctual, the same way they always did on weekends. I greeted them as I always did, warmth in my tone, though it was tempered by something I couldn't yet name. Their smiles were practiced, familiar, the kind that had comforted me when I was young but now felt slightly off. I didn't question it. I didn't need to. Trust had been ingrained over decades. We sat together at the table. My daughter babbled about a drawing she had made the night before. My parents nodded, murmuring approvals. It seemed natural, ordinary, the world working as it should. I noticed the small details that made a home feel lived in. The way my mother's hand brushed crumbs from the table with a fingertip. The way my father's pen balanced precariously on the edge of the notebook he always carried. I cataloged them silently, not because I suspected anything, but because I had learned early to observe, to see the spaces between words, the pauses that revealed more than speech ever could. I trusted that the little world I had created for my daughter was shared by those around us. There were no secrets in this room, or so I believed. My parents had been reliable in the past. They had taught me the quiet value of presence. Showing up mattered more than gifts or grand gestures. And so I allowed myself to relax, to imagine that the morning would unfold without disruption. After breakfast, my daughter insisted on showing her grandparents the drawings pinned on the fridge. They leaned close, commenting with interest. I watched their hands, the way they hovered over the edges of paper, careful not to press too hard. It was a subtle kind of attentiveness, one I recognized. It comforted me. We moved to the living room. I had placed small wrapped presents for my daughter on the floor earlier, a ritual I had maintained since her first birthday. I watched her tiny fingers trace the packages. Her eyes lit up, expectant, and I felt a surge of warmth. In these moments, trust felt simple, almost sacred. She trusted me completely. I trusted her grandparents, even with the faint unease that sometimes surfaced in my chest, quickly dismissed. Conversations were quiet, punctuated by laughter, soft murmurs, and the occasional question from my daughter. The room held an air of calm authority, where words were chosen carefully, and intentions were assumed honorable. I observed all of it without speaking, letting the small moments imprint themselves. This was the pattern I had relied on for years. Watch, note, trust, act only when necessary. And yet, as I poured tea into my cup, I noticed something, a hesitation in my mother's smile, a flicker in my father's eyes that didn't belong to him. It was faint, almost imperceptible, and I almost ignored it. Almost. But it stayed with me, a tiny irregularity in the surface of a world I believed solid. I didn't question it aloud. I didn't break the rhythm. The trust was too strong, the routines too ingrained. By mid-morning, the house hummed with quiet activity. My daughter played on the rug, my parents sipped tea and observed her. I stood near the window, silently watching the light move across the room, aware of the comfort that came with predictability. This was my sanctuary, my world. The ordinary, the consistent, the dependable. It was all I had built, all I had protected. And in that calm, in the gentle hum of trust and routine, I convinced myself that this was enough. That the world I had structured, carefully, silently, was safe. That the people I relied on could not betray the rhythm we shared. Yet beneath the surface, a single irregularity pulsed quietly, like a shadow stretching in sunlight. I did not see it fully. I only sensed it, a subtle hesitation in the morning's perfection. And for the first time, though I could not name it, I felt the faintest whisper of uncertainty. The next few days settled into the same quiet rhythm, yet the faint shadow I had noticed on my daughter's birthday lingered, subtle but persistent. It began with small, almost insignificant things. A glance that lingered too long, a delayed reply to a text, an offhand comment that didn't match the situation. I cataloged them quietly, my mind noting, not yet questioning, because I told myself these were oversights, human imperfections, nothing more. One morning, my mother offered to help with breakfast, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the butter. I observed her carefully, though I said nothing. My father seemed distracted, hovering near the doorway, checking his phone more often than usual. Each gesture alone was meaningless. Together, they formed a pattern that tugged at my awareness. At first, I dismissed it as fatigue or preoccupation. My parents were older. They had responsibilities I could not see. I reminded myself to trust, to give them the benefit of the doubt. Yet I could not ignore the subtle discomfort that prickled in the edges of my mind. It was a quiet tension, one that made me watch more, speak less. When we went out for a short walk with my daughter, I noticed my father's hand lingered near the phone in his pocket, fingers brushing it almost nervously. He smiled at her, but the warmth felt rehearsed. My mother laughed at something I said, a sound slightly hollow, too precise. The world around me was the same, yet it carried an undercurrent that I couldn't name. I told myself it was nothing. Back home, I began paying attention to how conversations unfolded. Comments that should have been natural felt slightly off. My parents would finish each other's sentences or suddenly redirect the topic when I asked simple questions. They were still polite, still engaged on the surface, but a tension underlay their words. A subtle insistence on normalcy, perhaps even on hiding. I felt the weight of it, a soft pressure that I didn't yet have the vocabulary to confront. Even my daughter sensed something. She tilted her head sometimes, as if noticing an invisible line in the air, and asked questions I hadn't anticipated. "Why does Grandma look sad sometimes?" she asked one morning, tugging at my sleeve. I smiled, offered a vague answer, and let her continue with her toys. I didn't want to plant worry in her, but the question lingered with me, pressing quietly. Small moments compounded. A receipt left carelessly on the counter, a text notification that disappeared too quickly to read, a casual mention of plans that didn't align with what I had been told. Each moment, isolated, was trivial, but together, they began to form a mosaic I could feel but not yet see. My mind, trained to notice, registered an unease that I could neither define nor act upon. I began to observe how my parents interacted with others when we visited friends or neighbors. Their behavior was impeccable, almost carefully curated, as if they were performing a version of themselves that I had not fully been allowed to witness. Yet when they thought no one was watching, or when they assumed I was distracted, I caught subtle slips, a look exchanged, a pause too long before an answer, a shift in posture that suggested discomfort or concealment. At night, when the house was quiet and my daughter asleep, I replayed the day in my mind. I cataloged the moments that felt wrong. Each one on its own was negligible, but together they hummed like a low note beneath the melody of normalcy. I lay awake, feeling the quiet tension settle in my chest. I wanted to dismiss it entirely, to return fully to the trust I had cultivated. But the awareness lingered, persistent and silent, like a shadow at the edge of vision. By the end of the week, I could no longer ignore the dissonance entirely. I still could not name it. I still could not act. But I felt the world shift subtly beneath me, a small, almost imperceptible tremor. Something in the quiet, orderly life I had built was not as it seemed. Trust was still present, but it was tempered now by unease. A question had been planted, soft, silent, and persistent, and though I did not yet know the answer, I knew the world I had relied upon was beginning to feel fragile. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself to be patient. But late at night, in the stillness, the quiet discomfort pressed against the edges of my awareness. It was the first sign that trust, once absolute, could be questioned. That the ordinary world might conceal more than it revealed. And though I could not yet see the full picture, I felt the weight of what was to come, faintly, beneath the surface. The unease that had been simmering through the past week began to harden into something more tangible. At first, the signs were subtle, a phrase that didn't match the context, a hesitation in response, a glance exchanged too quickly to notice at a glance. But over time, the inconsistencies became harder to ignore. My parents, once so predictable, were beginning to reveal gaps between what they said and what I knew to be true. It started with a small thing, a story my father told about running an errand that I had already confirmed had not happened. When I asked casually about it, he laughed and waved it off. "I must have remembered wrong," he said. The explanation sounded plausible, even comfortable, and I almost let it go. But the detail lingered. My mind catalogued it quietly, adding it to the growing mosaic of small deceptions. Later that day, I noticed my mother carefully rearranging the living room. On the surface, it was innocent, books aligned, cushions fluffed, but something about the motion was deliberate in a way that felt performative, as if she expected someone to notice or not notice. I paused, watching from the doorway, and felt the familiar tension rise in my chest. It was the first time I realized that their behaviors were not just distracted or tired, they were intentional. Then came the messages. My father's phone rang and he quickly silenced it, a flicker of panic crossing his face. My mother glanced at him, voice soft, almost conciliatory. "Not here," she murmured. They didn't know I was observing, but the interaction felt loaded, heavy with meaning I couldn't yet articulate. I noted it silently, storing the memory for later. Even my daughter seemed to pick up the undercurrent. She asked questions, innocent on the surface, but probing. Why did Grandma hide her phone? Or why is Grandpa upset? I deflected lightly, offering neutral answers, but I could not erase the questions from my mind. She was small, but her perception was sharp. And somehow she felt the tension I was only beginning to understand. A week later, a discrepancy in their schedules surfaced. My mother had told me she was visiting a friend, but a neighbor mentioned seeing her elsewhere. When I confronted her casually, she laughed and waved it off. "It was nothing, don't worry." But I noticed the small tremor in her voice. The carefully curated version of normalcy was beginning to crack. The cracks were faint, but I saw them. Other details began to accumulate. Receipts that didn't align with stories, messages that disappeared too quickly from shared devices, a casual mention of someone I had never met. Alone, Each could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. My quiet observation, my patient cataloging of details, began to paint a portrait I could no longer dismiss. The hardest part was the denial, the dismissal. Every time I raised a concern, even subtly, it was deflected or laughed away. "You're imagining things," my father said once, voice calm but firm. My mother mirrored him, her eyes soft, convincing. But the more I observed, the less I could convince myself that it was imagination. I had spent years training my attention to the spaces between words, to the invisible weight of gestures. Now, those instincts were telling me that something was very wrong. One evening, I found a small note tucked behind a book in the living room, a fragment of writing that did not belong to our family routines. It was brief, almost cryptic, but the handwriting was unmistakable. I held it in my hand, silent, letting the implications settle slowly. I did not confront them immediately. There was no need. The truth, I realized, was beginning to assert itself through evidence I could witness, through the quiet inconsistencies that no amount of denial could erase. By the end of the week, I felt the first real weight of suspicion. Trust, once unshakable, now felt fragile. Each interaction carried a hidden question. What were they hiding? Each glance, each movement, each word seemed calculated, intentional. The ordinary world I had relied upon, the mornings of calm, the shared routines, the sense of safety, was no longer sufficient. And for the first time, I acknowledged it fully, though silently. My parents, the ones I had trusted absolutely, were no longer entirely trustworthy. Something was concealed, and the evidence was mounting, patiently, quietly, in plain sight. I did not yet know the full scope, but the first red flags had been raised. The safe world I had relied upon had begun to tilt, and there was no returning to complete certainty. The first time I tried to voice my unease, the world shifted in a way I had not anticipated. I asked a simple question about an inconsistency in my parents' schedules, something I had quietly noted for days. My father laughed lightly, a sound meant to ease tension but laced with subtle dismissal. "You're imagining things," he said, leaning back in his chair as if to punctuate the statement. My mother nodded, soft agreement in her eyes, her smile unwavering. "You always worry too much," she added, her tone gentle, almost comforting, but it carried a weight of control I hadn't recognized before. I remained silent because that was what I had learned over the years. Confrontation without evidence was pointless. But the dismissal struck harder than any outright accusation. It wasn't just denial, it was an attempt to rewrite the reality I had observed. The unease that had been growing in me suddenly had a voice, not in speech, but in omission. My perceptions could be questioned, even erased. Over the following days, the gaslighting intensified subtly. Small things I noticed, the hidden phone, the unexplained outings, the cryptic messages, were met with calm, confident contradictions. "I don't know what you mean," my mother said one afternoon, brushing past a question about a missing receipt. "You must be mistaken." My father chimed in later. "We're not hiding anything. You're reading too much into nothing." Their language was simple, restrained, almost clinical, but its effect was corrosive. My mind, trained to observe, found the contradictions impossible to ignore, yet my voice felt powerless to challenge them. At home, the tension bled into ordinary routines. My daughter asked questions, innocent, probing, and I answered vaguely, careful not to escalate. But when my parents noticed her curiosity, their responses were precise, calculated. They corrected her gently when she referenced something she shouldn't have known. I watched, noting how they controlled the narrative, shaping perceptions without ever raising their voices. Their manipulation was quiet, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. The hardest moments were the ones that felt almost affectionate. My mother would touch my shoulder, smile at me, and speak in a soft tone that suggested care and concern. "Don't let your imagination run away with you," she said, and I felt the subtle shift of power in that simple sentence. It was not a rebuke. It was a quiet assertion of control. My father added to it with calm reasoning, logic that sounded sensible until I replayed it in my head and realized it conflicted with observable facts. The truth was still there, but they framed it as doubt in my own mind. One evening, I confronted a discrepancy in a receipt that suggested they had been somewhere they claimed not to be. My words were careful, precise, almost tentative. My father's response was immediate. "That's not possible. You're remembering wrong." My mother interjected softly. "Maybe you misread it. It happens." They maintained eye contact, steady and unyielding, leaving me to question myself. I had evidence, I had observation, but their calm insistence made me hesitate. The world I trusted seemed to push back against my own perception. Even my attempts to seek clarity were met with subtle dismissal. "You're too serious," they said, a critique framed as concern. Each comment, each correction, chipped away at the certainty I had once felt. I began to notice the quiet isolation that accompanied it. Friends I confided in seemed to see only the ordinary surface, the polite smiles, the normal routines. The subtle psychological pressure was invisible to anyone outside the house, but it weighed on me like a tangible thing. At night, when the house was silent, I replayed the interactions. Each contradiction, each dismissive word, each carefully placed gesture formed a web of manipulation I could not yet untangle. The gaslighting was effective because it was slow, methodical, emotionally restrained. There were no loud accusations, no dramatic confrontations, just a quiet undermining of my confidence, my perception, my trust. By the end of the week, I realized something essential. Their control was not exercised through shouting or threat. It was exercised through calm, persistent denial. By convincing me that I was mistaken, they maintained the upper hand. And though I observed, catalogued, and noted, I remained trapped in the silent acknowledgement of their power. I could see the truth forming around the edges, but each attempt to speak it out loud risked further dismissal, another layer of quiet control. I learned to restrain my voice, to measure each word. I listened more, recorded more, watched more closely. My unease had evolved into certainty, but expression of it invited confrontation I was not yet ready to provoke. And in that careful observation, I realized that the betrayal was no longer potential. It was active, deliberate, and the consequences, though not yet fully visible, were already in motion. The first undeniable evidence arrived quietly, like a shadow slipping under the door. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no shouted accusations, but it carried weight that could not be dismissed. I found a small envelope tucked between my mother's papers, addressed to a name I didn't recognize. Inside were receipts, notes, and fragments of messages that contradicted everything they had told me. My hands shook slightly as I traced the lines of text, each word confirming the suspicions I had harbored silently for weeks. I did not confront them immediately. I had learned that restraint was the most effective form of observation. Instead, I cataloged everything meticulously. Every receipt, every message, every cryptic note went into a folder I kept hidden. I observed patterns that began to form, like threads in a tapestry slowly revealing the image behind it. My parents' deception was methodical, deliberate, yet imperfect, enough for me to notice if I paid attention. A neighbor inadvertently became a witness to part of their truth. During a casual conversation, she mentioned seeing my mother at a boutique on a day she claimed to have been home. My father's absence that day also aligned with the evidence I had gathered. The neighbor's words were unintentional, unfiltered, and yet they resonated louder than any confession. I remained calm, absorbing the information silently, aware of the significance without revealing my awareness. Then came the digital traces. I discovered inconsistencies in shared calendars, entries that contradicted their verbal accounts. A message deleted too quickly from a device, an email accidentally left open, a hidden tab in a browser. They all hinted at a life hidden from me, a pattern of concealment that I could no longer ignore. I didn't need to interrogate them. The evidence spoke for itself, revealing a truth they had assumed I would never notice. Even my daughter's observations contributed to the emerging picture. She asked innocent, probing questions. Why did Grandma whisper on the phone? Or why did Grandpa hide the bag? Her curiosity, unfiltered and unself-conscious, offered clues I might have missed as an adult. I did not dismiss her questions, but neither did I give explanations. Instead, I absorbed, cataloged, and began to understand the scale of what had been hidden from me. The impact was quiet but sharp. Trust, once absolute, fractured incrementally with every new piece of evidence. I noticed how my parents began to adjust their behavior subtly, perhaps sensing that the veil of secrecy was lifting. My father answered questions with even more precision. My mother's gestures carried an extra layer of caution. The tension, always present in small doses, was becoming palpable. I began to notice how systems around them inadvertently recorded their duplicity. The credit card statements, the delivery notifications, even mundane maintenance bills, they all pointed to inconsistencies in their accounts of daily life. I had never paid such close attention before, but now every ordinary system became a witness. Every record was a quiet testament to the reality they tried to conceal. I did not confront them. Confrontation was premature. Instead, I allowed the truth to accumulate, to solidify in a way that could not be denied. I kept notes, tracked patterns, and observed their reactions when certain subjects arose. Each reaction, each slip of the tongue, each hesitation confirmed what I already suspected. They believed I was still in the dark, still bound by trust. But I had begun to see the outlines of the truth clearly. One afternoon, my mother mentioned an errand she claimed to have run alone. I silently checked the calendar entries and delivery logs, and the evidence contradicted her statement. Later, a brief conversation with a distant relative hinted at financial decisions they had made without my knowledge, decisions that directly affected my daughter. I felt the weight of it quietly, the way one feels a cold draft in a room previously thought sealed. In these moments, I realized that exposure did not need to be loud. Evidence, witnesses, and records had begun to whisper the truth. My parents' careful performance, the facade they maintained for years, was failing, not because of confrontation, but because reality leaves traces. The fragments of their deception, when gathered, formed a narrative that could no longer be rewritten. I sat quietly that evening, my daughter asleep, the room dim. The house felt different, heavier, layered with the truths I had uncovered. I did not celebrate, did not gloat. The knowledge weighed on me. Power, I realized, was shifting, not through argument or action, but through silent observation, through the accumulation of evidence, through the patience of restraint. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I understood that the first real reversal had begun. The veil was lifting. The world I had trusted was no longer whole. Betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was partially visible, undeniable in fragments, and entirely mine to observe, catalog, and understand before the next stage unfolded. The calm of observation was replaced by tension, subtle but unrelenting. Once the fragments of truth began to surface, the quiet equilibrium that had governed our lives shifted. My parents, who had once moved through the house with rehearsed ease, now navigated it cautiously, as if aware that someone was watching more closely than before. They did not speak of the inconsistencies, nor did they acknowledge my awareness, but the atmosphere carried a new weight, a taut, invisible thread connecting every gesture, glance, and word. The escalation began with small reactions. A casual question about schedules elicited more hesitation than before. My father's voice, calm yet measured, carried a hint of edge I had not heard in months. "Why do you ask so many questions lately?" he said. My mother's hand hovered briefly over a book on the counter, fingers trembling imperceptibly. These were minor actions, easily overlooked, but my mind catalogued them carefully. The tension was no longer a whisper, it had become a pulse in the room. Their attempts to maintain normalcy were more deliberate, bordering on performative. They adjusted routines, rephrased statements, and inserted pauses as if rehearsing in real time. Every casual smile or light-hearted comment carried a double weight, a veneer designed to obscure. The fractures in their behavior, once subtle, now had edges sharp enough to cut through the facade. I observed it all silently, careful not to give away my understanding. Each slip, each calculated gesture, revealed the increasing stakes of their deception. One evening, I found a message on a shared device that had not been intended for my eyes, a fragment of planning, a note that contradicted a story they had told days earlier. I did not confront them immediately. Instead, I watched. Later, I noticed my father linger by the living room window, his posture tense, eyes darting toward the street as if expecting someone. My mother moved with careful precision, adjusting objects on shelves in a way that seemed almost symbolic, a ritual to maintain order in a world unraveling beneath their control. The psychological pressure they exerted in response to my quiet observation was subtle, invisible to anyone untrained. My questions were met with calm but pointed counterstatements. A misremembered fact became a reason for correction. A concern became a demonstration of my supposed oversensitivity. They were testing boundaries, gauging how far they could push before I reacted. And I did not react. Restraint had become my shield. Even our daughter sensed the tension. She would glance at my parents with curiosity, asking questions they deftly deflected. My mother would redirect the conversation with soft laughter. My father would offer explanations that were factually ambiguous but emotionally persuasive. Their responses were layered, calculated to maintain control without confrontation. I watched the exchange, noting the power dynamics at play, the quiet but deliberate manipulation. The escalation also brought financial and social traces into view. Small inconsistencies appeared in household expenses, in invitations they claimed not to have extended, in events I had been excluded from without explanation. Each detail, when combined with the evidence I had gathered previously, painted a broader picture of concealment and strategic maneuvering. They were no longer merely hiding. They were actively protecting a version of reality that suited them. Despite the growing clarity of their deception, I remained silent, emotionally restrained. I did not shout, did not confront, did not demand answers. Instead, I catalogued, observed, and waited. My restraint became a quiet assertion of power, the power to understand, to see, to record, to anticipate the consequences without giving them the satisfaction of immediate confrontation. Their reactions grew more pronounced, though still subtle to the untrained eye. My father's brief moments of irritation were masked by calm tones. My mother's carefully measured gestures suggested composure while conveying urgency. The tension in the house became a living thing, a low hum beneath ordinary conversation, impossible to ignore once acknowledged. I felt the weight of it, a presence in the air, a tangible pressure that mirrored the mounting clarity of the betrayal around me. I realized then that escalation did not require confrontation. The stakes were rising quietly but sharply. The evidence I had collected, combined with their visible unease, created an environment where truth was asserting itself without a single word of acknowledgement. Their control was faltering, and every gesture, every hesitation, every misstep became a marker of their vulnerability. By the end of this period, the quiet world I had relied upon was fractured. My parents, once untouchable in their authority, were now navigating a landscape where my understanding, my observation, and my restraint were unyielding. The invisible balance of power had shifted, imperceptibly to them but undeniable to me. I knew the next stages would demand patience, precision, and emotional control. Escalation had arrived. The stakes were higher, the tension sharper, and the consequences quietly taking shape. And in that silence, I realized the full extent of what I was witnessing. Power was not loud. It did not demand attention. It was revealed in systems, in small gestures, in calculated mistakes, and in the patience of the observer. I understood now that the moment of reckoning was approaching, not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet inevitability. The realization of truth came gradually, a slow, insistent pressure that settled deep within me. By now, every inconsistency, every whispered omission, every carefully framed lie had converged into a pattern that could not be denied. The betrayal was no longer potential. It was a tangible presence, embedded in the routines, gestures, and quiet manipulations of my parents. And yet, despite the weight of understanding, I did not allow myself to react impulsively. Restraint had become a form of power, and power, I had learned, revealed itself in patience and observation rather than confrontation. I remember the afternoon most clearly. My daughter had drawn a picture for her grandparents, a small sketch filled with bright colors and innocent detail. She handed it to my mother, who accepted it with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I watched, silent, as my father glanced at it briefly, then looked away. In that pause, I saw something unmistakable, a flicker of recognition, an awareness that the truth was on the verge of exposure, and that their careful control was faltering. By this point, the accumulation of evidence weighed on me heavily. Receipts, messages, calendar discrepancies, the neighbors' observations, all of it pointed to a betrayal that affected not just me, but my daughter as well. The cost of their deception had become real, concrete, and deeply personal. And yet, even with the clarity, my emotional response was contained. I did not cry. I did not yell. I did not storm the house demanding answers. I simply observed, catalogued, and allowed the reality of the situation to settle around me, a heavy and undeniable truth. The moral weight of the situation was almost unbearable. I understood the choices they had made, the calculations behind their concealment, and the subtle manipulations that had kept the facade intact for so long. I felt the impact of their actions not only in the betrayal itself, but in the quiet damage it inflicted on my daughter, on the trust that I had worked so hard to cultivate. And yet, I recognized that my response could not be driven by anger alone. Impulsive action would grant them the satisfaction of reaction, the illusion of control, and perhaps allow them to obscure further evidence. Instead, I made a decision: restraint. Emotional, deliberate, and unyielding restraint. I allowed the full weight of the truth to enter my consciousness, acknowledged it in its entirety, and committed myself to observing without immediate confrontation. Every interaction, every gesture, every word would be a measure, a quiet assertion of awareness. I would not allow their lies to manipulate my perception any longer. I would watch, and I would let reality unfold. Even the smallest moments carried weight. My daughter's innocent questions, the flicker of a lie in my parents' eyes, the subtle shifts in their routines, all of it became markers of the world I now inhabited. I cataloged these markers in silence, each one a quiet testament to the betrayal I had uncovered. The psychological cost was immense, but it was internalized. I bore it privately, a heavy burden of understanding and awareness. The moral clarity I reached was simple but profound. I could not change the past. I could not undo the decisions my parents had made. What I could do, however, was witness. I could ensure that their actions were recorded, remembered, and acknowledged, not with public confrontation, but with quiet, undeniable truth. The moral breaking point was not a scream, not a public reckoning. It was the conscious decision to bear witness, to recognize the betrayal, and to choose restraint as a weapon of quiet power. I began to act within this framework, subtly shifting routines to protect my daughter and preserve the integrity of the environment around us. I asked neutral, probing questions, observed responses, and recorded evidence without accusation. Each measured action reinforced the balance of power I now held. I did not need to confront. The truth, slowly accumulating, was already a force greater than any words I could speak. By nightfall, the house felt different. The tension was no longer just an external pressure. It was internalized, carried within me. I recognized the cost of what had been revealed, and I felt the profound gravity of the betrayal in every quiet moment. The absence of honesty, the fractured trust, the subtle but persistent undermining of my certainty. Yet, in that gravity, I also found clarity. The world was no longer naive. It was revealed in full complexity, and I had learned to navigate it with deliberate restraint. The emotional breaking point was reached not in tears or outcry, but in acknowledgement. Understanding that trust could be violated, that betrayal could be hidden in plain sight, and that the only way to maintain agency was through calm observation, quiet evidence gathering, and deliberate restraint. The moral cost was real, but it was accepted. And in that acceptance, power shifted, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, patient recognition of truth. I understood finally that restraint was the only way to honor the truth, protect my daughter, and navigate the fragile landscape that my parents had fractured. My awareness had become my strength, and silence had become my tool. I did not rejoice. I did not act impulsively. I watched, carefully, patiently, letting the truth assert itself in ways they could neither control nor deny. The truth, once partial and fragmented, began to solidify into undeniable reality. It did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation or a climactic revelation. It crept in through systems, witnesses, and records that could no longer be dismissed. My parents' carefully constructed facade, built over years of omission and subtle manipulation, was collapsing quietly, yet with an inevitability I could see in every gesture, every word, and every interaction. The first concrete consequence appeared in their routines. Tasks that had once been seamless now carried hesitation and over-precision. My father double-checked his phone, glanced over his shoulder, and paused mid-conversation, as if anticipating observation. My mother handled correspondence with a careful scrutiny that suggested fear of exposure. These were small behaviors, almost invisible to an outsider, but unmistakable to me. Their control, so meticulously maintained, was slipping. Financial inconsistencies surfaced next. Receipts I had cataloged earlier aligned with statements I accessed discreetly. Expenses that had been hidden or misrepresented could no longer be reconciled with their stories. Even subtle shifts in budgeting, seemingly trivial adjustments, revealed the scale of decisions taken without transparency. Evidence was no longer fragmentary. It had become a narrative that spoke clearly, quietly condemning the deception that had been denied for so long. A neighbor, previously unaware of my awareness, began to offer details inadvertently. Casual remarks, offhand comments about where they had been or who they had spoken to, confirmed my suspicions. Each witness acted without intention, yet their unfiltered accounts became part of the quiet weight of exposure. I observed without acknowledgement, cataloged without confrontation, and allowed these external confirmations to reinforce the reality I already understood. My daughter's innocence offered another mirror. She repeated details she had noticed in passing, comments, glimpses, gestures, that aligned perfectly with my records. I did not interrogate her. I did not draw attention to her observations. Instead, I absorbed, noted, and integrated these pieces into the growing mosaic of consequences. She was unaware of the impact, but her perspective illuminated the scale of what had been hidden, a truth that was visible in fragments if one only looked carefully. The most telling moments, however, were the subtle shifts in my parents' own behavior. Their attempts to maintain normalcy became increasingly strained. My father's responses grew more measured, almost perfunctory, as if each word were carefully weighed to avoid further exposure. My mother's gestures carried tension beneath a veneer of politeness, movements precise and deliberate, almost ritualistic. Their power, once absolute within the household, was quietly undermined by the accumulation of evidence I held silently in my hands. There was no dramatic confrontation, no accusation shouted across the room. Instead, consequences manifested in quiet shifts. Invitations once casually extended were withdrawn, conversations were carefully filtered, and decisions previously made without consideration of others were now calculated with visible caution. The control my parents had exercised over the household, over perception, over narratives, was gradually and quietly eroding. Even the systems they had relied upon, calendars, financial accounts, digital communication, betrayed them. Every record, once carefully managed, now revealed traces of their duplicity. They could not erase the evidence entirely, and they did not attempt to explain it. Their silence, their meticulous care, and their restrained denial only highlighted the inevitability of exposure. I held nothing back. I offered no confrontation. Yet the truth, undeniable and unyielding, began to assert its presence in every interaction. The psychological weight of observation rested heavily on me. I felt the moral and emotional consequences of their choices, the fractured trust, the deception, the quiet betrayal that had shaped our world. And yet, I maintained restraint, knowing that these subtle shifts, these quiet adjustments, were more revealing than any confrontation could be. The evidence was cumulative, the reality was unavoidable, the consequences were unfolding naturally, without dramatics, without spectacle, and without acknowledgement. By the end of this period, the imbalance of power had shifted subtly but irrevocably. My parents, once unassailable in authority and control, now moved cautiously, measured in words and gestures, aware, perhaps unconsciously, that the truth had begun to claim its space. I observed, quiet and restrained, knowing that the culmination of betrayal had reached a stage where the consequences were unavoidable, manifesting in the smallest details of daily life. The house, the routines, the gestures, all spoke a truth they could not erase. The quiet settling of reality had begun. The betrayal was no longer speculative. It was recorded in systems, reflected in witnesses, and mirrored in subtle shifts in behavior. There was no spectacle, no vindication, no dramatic collapse. Only a slow, unrelenting truth, and the subtle, inescapable consequences that followed.